Hi class. So this week we're going to do this in two parts too. This we're dealing with conflict and negotiation. So let's move along for part one. So blame. The secret to success is knowing who to blame for your failures. Unfortunately, some people act like that in organizations, and that's not the way that we want to train you to act. So let's first define conflict. Conflict is any situation in which incompatible goals, attitudes, emotions, or behaviors lead to disagreement or opposition between two or more parties. It's not necessarily bad. It's just that you see it one way and I see it another. Now, it could be bad, but it could be very benign as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a, one person doesn't have to be evil for there to be a conflict. It could be two people that are thinking about this just differently, and that's okay. Functional conflict is a healthy version of conflict, constructive disagreement between two or more people. Now, that means that you think we ought to do the project this way, I think we ought to do it that way. That's functional. That's okay. Dysfunctional conflict is unhealthy. It's usually disagreement between two or more people where it starts to get personal, and that becomes very toxic. Okay, now, before we talk more about conflict, let's talk about emotional intelligence, because this is an important idea. Emotional intelligence is the power to control one's own emotions, to be able to rein yourself in, okay? To perceive emotions in others, to understand kind of where they're coming from, or be able to put the phrase is to walk in someone else's shoes, to adapt to change, and to manage adversity. Now, 21% of your time, get that figure in your head. As managers, we spend 21% of our time dealing with conflict. That's 1 minute in every 5. I mean, that's a lot of time that you're spending conflict. That's just the way things work. Okay. Now, there are positive consequences to conflict, such as new ideas and creativity, and being able to serve as a safety valve to show where problems are in the process. Those are positive things. Then there's also negative things. For example, conflict often wastes resources and creates a negative climate. So you want to be able to figure out what kind of conflict you're dealing with and be able to work with it quickly to deal with it. Diagnosing conflict, you just examine the issue. Find out what's going on. Is it functional or is it dysfunctional? What's going on in the context? Perhaps there's a reason that they don't like each other because it's personal. You'll probably have a hard time if you're ever in Israel or Palestine or something. If it's an Arab or an Israeli, they just don't like each other. That's not functional. That's dysfunctional. You have to know which it is right away. So you have to know the parties involved. Okay, so diagnostic questions. Are the parties approaching the conflict from a hostile standpoint? That's question 1. 2, is the outcome likely to be a negative for the organization? That's question 3. Do potential losses of parties exceed any potential gains? And is energy being diverted from goal accomplishment? Now, if you can answer yes to any of these questions, your conflict is dysfunctional. Try to solve it as quickly as possible. Causes of conflict are either structural or they're personal factors. Structural factors are things like specialization, the way that you see it is different than somebody else in a different specialization, interdependence, common resources, goal differences, jurisdictional ambiguities. Okay, that's structural kind of issues. And then there's the personal side. So what kind of skills do you bring to the table? What kind of personalities are at play? What values, ethics, emotions, things along those lines, cultural differences come into play. Both sides can cause conflict. Now, cultural differences are important. So things like how individualistic is your culture as opposed to collective, and we talked about that previously, or what's a time orientation or power distance that you're okay with. All these kind of issues can cause conflict between people. Now, when I say between people, there's a number of different levels at which you can have conflict between people. And you want to get to understand these. I know that there are test questions on these kind of things. So, for example, inter-organizational conflict is conflict that occurs between two or more organizations. That's inter, as opposed to intergroup. Okay, inter-organization is between two or more organizations. Intergroup is between two or more groups. Intra, I-N-T-R-A, group conflict occurs within the group. So inter is between two different entities. Intra is within the entity. Okay? Interpersonal conflict, interpersonal conflict is conflict that occurs between two or more individuals, as opposed to intrapersonal conflict, which is conflict that occurs within an individual. Okay, so anytime you see intra, it's within. Anytime you see inter, it's between. Okay, Now, what do you do with this? How do you manage interpersonal conflict? Well, you have to understand power networks, who has power, who doesn't, how it works, how people are connected. You have to recognize defense mechanisms, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit, and then develop strategies to deal with difficult people. Let's talk about forms of interpersonal conflict first. Inter-role. Inter-role is between roles, right? A person's experience of conflict among multiple roles within his life. So let's say that you're a marketing professional and you're a parent and you're the head of the local nonprofit organization, right? And all these things are vying for your attention at the same time. That's inter-role conflict, okay? Intra-role is within. Intra is conflict that occurs within a single role, such as when a person receives conflicting messages from role senders about how to perform a certain role. And then person-role conflict is conflict between when an individual is expected to perform behaviors that a certain role has conflict with his or her own values. So person-role deals with values, okay? So if you're just not comfortable as a marketing professional, say, saying a certain thing in your advertising or the types of pictures that you use or whatever, that's person-role conflict, okay? Now, resolving intrapersonal conflict. That's intra, that's within. Okay? Use self-analysis. You have to think what's going on. Perhaps your organization's values match your organization, and maybe they don't. If they don't match, you're going to have some difficulty. I put two clips in on this, and that was one was the Marine Corps, and another is the Peace Corps. And if you look at those two different clips, you're going to have very different values being espoused by those two different types of people that are attracted to those organizations. Okay, an organizational member's role set. Now, you're going to have a lot pulling on you. You are in one position, and you know, a colleague needs your attention, or a client or supplier sometimes does. Your supervisor makes demands, and then you have to deal with employees, and so you're being pulled many different directions simultaneously as you're doing your role or performing your role. Now, this could be in very different ways. It could be equal versus equal. Maybe you're just dealing with people of all the same rank. In that case, you're going to have perhaps sub-optimization, and you're going to compete with each other, and you're going to have that kind of friction. Or maybe you don't have that problem, but your boss is the problem, and there's an issue between control and autonomy. That is, that you're now having motivational problems because you're being told what to do, or maybe it's something else. Whatever it is, as long as human beings are going to be involved in organizations, you're going to have problems. Okay, that's the end of part one. When I come back in part two, we'll finish this not just with conflict, but then we'll get into negotiation as well.